talking to my wife yesterday and said, I need to get back in the studio. I need to get back on the podcast. I've been slacking. As is life, things happen. Certain things take priority. So I've been missing out on recording this podcast. And I asked her, what do you think it should be about? We'll do something more female friendly. I think she had just listened to the one I did on steroids or something like that. She said, do something ladies would like. I said, okay. So I started thinking about it, and I said, why don't I do some kind of condition that, affects women disproportionately more than it affects men. I said, that's great. So that's what we're going to do today. For the ladies, we're going to talk hip dysplasia. Now, what is that? Hip dysplasia is essentially where your femur, the head of it, does not fit deep enough into your hip socket in your pelvis. So it's something you're born with, and it's much more prominent in women. About 80% of the cases are women. So they're at the greatest risk, and that goes into kind of a dancing story, which I'll touch on later. But essentially, you're born with a too shallow of a hip socket. And 60% of the time, it's on the left hip. And like I said, 80% of the time, it happens in women. On top of that, there's some other factors that put you at higher risk, right? If you're born breached, that's one of them. If the oldest child, it's more common that they get it. I'm not sure why that is, what sense that makes, but that's part of it. If you're an identical twin, there's a higher chance of you having it. It could be one or both, but it definitely increases your chances, and of course, being female. Now, how do you discover you have hip dysplasia? Well, the doctor does a test on you when you're born, and at that point, if he detects it, which, like I said, it's about 1 in 1,000. However, it definitely differs among different races. For instance, African Americans had a much lower rate of developing hip dysplasia, or being born with it, I should say. And Native Americans actually had the highest rate at 72 per 1,000. Again, no one knows. This isn't something that's studied so intensely that a lot of answers have been uncovered. They're just going by statistics for the most part. And what you'll notice from it, if you continue to live with the hip dysplasia, is, things like different leg lengths. Your gait when you run or walk will be a little abnormal. Your agility will not be something that is a strength of yours, or you'll feel it decrease as you get older, as the hip dysplasia takes more of an effect, and just general instability of your hip. Now, if they do catch it early, there are certain treatment options, right? There's one called a Pavlik harness. They put the baby in for a couple weeks. Looks extremely uncomfortable, but it's a way for the hip to develop correct. And one thing they'll urge you against, especially if you have this harness on, but even without it, if you swaddle your baby too tight, that can affect how their hips develop, because they're still obviously growing outside the womb. Now, if that harness doesn't work, sometimes they'll do, it's called a reduction surgeries, where they get in there and they fit the hip correctly and allow it to heal. They'll be in a cast for 6 to 12 weeks, and then they'll go about just living a normal life. Now, in adults, the surgery is a little different. You can do, so if you have it as an adult, let me just start here. There's things that can happen if it's untreated and you grow up with this hip dysplasia. You can have a labral tear. Now, what that is basically a layer of cartilage that lines between your ball and socket joint in your pelvis. And what happens is that'll tear. It'll get worn down, it'll tear. It's very hard to treat, as it is mostly cartilage, so that limited blood supply makes it very hard to heal. The other thing that can happen is arthritis, and then the worst part is dislocation of the hip. Just because it's gotten so weak, it just gives out and dislocates. Now, what adults do as far as treatment for this kind of thing is there's something called an arthroscopy. And what that does, they repair the labrum. And the idea is that as long as the labrum's healthy, you'll be able to have a pretty normal life with that hip, right? You spent, let's say, 35 years breaking it down. So now it's torn. So if they can repair it, there's another 35 years, right, that you can break it down. And the other one is an osteotomy, and that's a little bit more intense, where they go in as an adult and they fit it back in. Much more painful, longer recovery period, sure, but sometimes it's what you have to do. And then, of course, the worst would be a hip replacement. Now, people are good at hip replacements. Doctors are great at it. So once you have it, you can live a very normal life. And docs even say, about 10% of the hip replacements they do are due to hip dysplasia. So, as far as, hip ailments go, it's a pretty big chunk coming from, something you're born with, which is supposed to be 1 in 1,000, right? But there's tons of people, and it seems like it'll ultimately lead to hip replacement as you get older. Now, as far as rehabbing from hip dysplasia, so like I said, surgery is not always required. That's kind of the last step, like on most things. The first thing they always want you to do is x-rays, CT scans, figure it out, go to PT, and try to use non-surgical ways of healing it. And it definitely can be done, right? Band work, any kind of stretching. There's plenty of different abductor exercises and rotational exercises you can do to try to strengthen that hip. And while they won't come out and say it, the odds are that if you just have a stronger pelvic region, right? Your glutes, your adductors, your quads. If you have good strength through all those muscle groups, odds are you'll be fine, even if you do have a shallow socket, because that's ultimately, even in your shoulder, that's how you take care of that labrum, right? Is if you have a strong enough, well-developed shoulder, the labrum can tear, and it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. You'll still be able to perform your everyday tasks because that shoulder's supported. The biggest thing about labrums, and that's ultimately why you have to have surgeries, because your hip has destroyed your labrum because of that shallow socket. That bone has been pounding on that labrum. The number one side effect of a labral surgery is inability to repair, and it's like a 50-50 proposition. It's a hard thing to heal. It's just, something that you ultimately need to get kind of lucky on for it to be a successful surgery. It's not an exact science because you just can't get blood flow to that area. So if you don't have blood flow, it's almost impossible to heal something. So while I'm sure doctors have gotten better and better at this through the years, it's still something, whether it's your shoulder or your hip, that it's something that surgery is not going to give you that better quality of life, I should say. The physical therapy is what you ultimately need to do, which will lead to actual lifting weights and getting stronger muscle group that will ultimately give you the better life. As far as activity goes, if you got a hip dysplasia, you obviously can't do any of the hard pounding stuff. You can still golf and bowling. Those are still safe because they aren't high impact on your hip. And even if you do that, it's probably smart to, get some heat on it before you do any kind of activities, whether it's rehab or golfing, and then ice it after. Take anti-inflammatories, things like that. Now, there are some good, funny stories. Not funny so much, just interesting, is they did a study on dancers that developed hip dysplasia. And it makes sense, right? I mean, they're running, jumping, they're constantly stretching. It makes sense that they'll have more flexibility in their hips, which can maybe put stress on the hips, but it's actually kind of cart before the horse situation. The amount of dancers that actually already had hip dysplasia was at a very high rate. And what's attributed to it is if you have hip dysplasia, you automatically have more flexibility. So it helped them in dancing and becoming successful in dancing. Now, the downside is once they're done dancing, they've done so much damage to their hip and they've destroyed that labrum, they have hip replacement, or they should have hip replacement. The conundrum is when these dancers are done, they go into teaching. If they have a hip replacement, their range of motion is now extremely limited. So here's the catch. If you're a dance instructor and you have hip replacement, you can't really demonstrate the dance move. But if you leave it alone, you'll still have that flexibility and you'll be able to, demonstrate the moves, but you're going to be in pain because your labrum's torn. So that was, kind of interesting. I would get the knee replacement immediately, but I also don't have a passion for teaching dance to young ladies. So that's about it, guys. Moral of the story, hip dysplasia, you're born with it, you don't develop it. There's plenty you can do to prevent it, or prevent it from controlling your life, I should say. You're always going to have it, but if you have the muscle groups around it built up, you'll be fine, and that applies to the shoulder labrum as well. Keep stretching, keep working those abductors, and that's about it, guys. Hope this was it's more kind of an informative podcast than an opinion piece or a research piece, but maybe you learned something. Thanks for checking it out, guys. I know it's been a while. I'll try to stay on top of it a little more, but I will see you next time. Going.